poor boy. The most interesting thing about him was we went back to Germany and the America House exchanges that the United States had with Germany, and my wife played the violin and I gave lectures. When was that, honey? In 1957. And when she was at Fulda, I found that my father's father had come from Germany at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, and so we went to the church there, and the church records went back about 13 generations, and I found that my father, although he told me he was a poor boy in New York and described his long life to healthy living and so on, and good peasant stock when that he came from, that all his 13 lineal ancestors died at the age of about 50, before 50, I guess in northern Germany near Tresen, near Fulda. It was an area where you could get grip in the winter, and they hadn't discovered antibiotics or something like that. But anyway, my technical career began at MIT, and probably one of the interesting things was I had the pleasure of investigating the first catalytic cracking process that Eugene Houdry, who was a promoter, as well as Anne Van Tor, had persuaded one of the directors of Vacuum Oil, Harold Abrams, which was just then being acquired by Mobile, and he had something in catalytic cracking. And what he had was quite interesting. His father was a steel magnate, and he was a playboy that liked to drive racing cars. And the racing cars, in order to have a small weight, didn't have any gear shifts, so they'd have to be pushed to get started. And as a result, high-octane gasoline was very important, and they made gasoline by mixing up alcohol and benzene and tetrethyl lead, really quite a cocktail. But he became acquainted with a druggist in France who had found that if he passed shale oil over clay that was found in southern France, that he could make an astonishing high-octane number, and Houdry put it in his car and found that he could start right off without any knock, so he figured he had something, and he brought the plant to this country, and my first job was with Mobile, was a member of 2 or 3 people investigating the Houdry process to decide whether it should be installed in the United States. And so I had the pleasure of living with Houdry and hearing all kinds of talks about catalysis. Naturally, being a Frenchman, Sabatier's book was his Bible, the first book on catalysis, and of course he told us how French children first learned how to drink alcohol. They could take a glass of water and then gradually change it to where they put a little wine in the water. My counterpart, who was also investigating the process, was a man by the name of Vladimir Ship, who had been an assistant to Apatiev in Russia. And Ship had an entirely opposite personality from Houdry. Houdry was a ebullient, French entertainer. And so Ship, after Houdry gave us this lecture about how one became acquainted with drinking wine, said, "Monsieur Houdry," and Monsieur Houdry says, "Yes." He says, he says, "I hate dry talks on wet subjects." He always had some kind of statement like that to deflate people. So we had quite a bit of fun with Houdry. Probably just to say one, is this the kind of stuff you want? So Monsieur Houdry had the plant which he was demonstrating, and I suppose it would be about 100 barrels a day. He called it the 10-ton unit down in Paulsboro. And his scheme in cracking was to first pass gas oil over the catalyst, which was a fixed bed, and then pass, after it went through, to pass the second pass, which was more refractory, over the same catalyst, and then the third over the same catalyst, and finally he got up to about 6 passes over the catalyst. And so we made a bet on how much gasoline he could make per pass as a result of this thing. And I still remember what the bet was. A Frenchman would want to bet something like champagne, and that was it. A bottle of 1926 Lanson was what the bet was. If we made more than 24% of gasoline on the first pass, I'd lose the bet. Well, I won the bet, and being a good Frenchman, why, he didn't just say, here's a bottle of 1926 Lanson. He had to put us up in his, put us up to a dinner with his partner who had come from France, and we started out with various other drinks, and finally came to the 1926 Lanson, and finally came to some 20-year-old brandy, which I, being only in my 20s, knocked off just like that, and whereupon Houdry gave me a lecture on how 20-year-old brandy should be drunk, you know, sniffed and gradually warmed up and so on. And then I kept sort of in touch with Houdry. This was in the 1930s. His process didn't turn out to be quite effective at the time because there was no demand for high-octane gasoline. But it turned out to be a very important thing for the war effort. You know, one war is always was being fought on the basis of the previous war. So I guess the Second World War was being fought on the basis of what to do about the Maginot Line or something like that. And they figured, R.E. Wilson, who was director of research and finally, I guess, president of Standard of Indiana, decided that they should not need more than 5,000 barrels a day of high-octane gasoline for aviation. And the war didn't get along very far before they found that they needed 50,000 barrels a day of aviation gasoline. So that his predictions were a little bit off, and so the Houdry process, which would produce high-octane number in racing cars, was also just the thing to produce high-octane number for gasoline for planes. And that's really what set the process of catalytic cracking forward. And Ciccone worked with fixed beds, and then in Jersey, with the aid of W.K. Lewis, changed to fluidized beds. But somebody from Mobile told me they're still running some of these fixed bed catalytic cracking units. Then I came up against Houdry again after I was with Mobile a few more years. They put me on a team to design and build a butadiene plant in Texas. The next emergency that had arisen was the Japanese had cut off the United States from from natural rubber, and we had to develop synthetic rubber. So we, our technical team, consisting of a man from each of the 5 oil companies in the Gulf area, traveled around and collected technical information on how you could make butadiene. It could be made from alcohol, but of course then as now making gasoline from alcohol or making butadiene from alcohol wasn't the cheapest way to go. So Houdry had proposed, and we were about to put in a plant that this inventor had also developed and still used, a process for making butene and butadiene from butane. But the government wanted the steel more for aviation than for building butadiene plants, and they decided that they could collect the butene from these 5 refineries, and probably more butene available. So we built pipelines from the 5 refineries to bring the mixture containing butene in, separate the butene, and we did away with Houdry's process. And so just to end the story on Houdry, the next time I came in touch with him was when he got the Perkin medal about 20 years later, and I walked up to him, and he says to me, John, he says, you know, darling, I made a wonderful discovery. And he said, cracking is just the same as the human body. Your lungs build up coke in them just the way a catalyst unit builds up coke, and you can burn the coke out in just exactly the same way. And the way to do it, he had found, was to live in a house. He had a lot of money finally, and both from his father and his promoting, that had 25% oxygen. He was living in 25% oxygen, and he said, you know, besides that, he said, it increases your joie de vivre. And about 6 months later, he was dead from the joie de vivre. That was the end of Hootie. But
how did you come to go to work at Mobil?
Well, I worked at MIT. I got my master's degree at MIT, and the oil companies were hiring more chemical engineers in those days than anybody else. And I lived in Brooklyn, and the man that came up to hire people from MIT for Mobile told me that Mobile had a refinery in Brooklyn. So I decided that would be a nice place to work. I liked living in Brooklyn, and so there I started at Mobile, and I had a rather good experience there. I started their first process engineering group that the company had, about a dozen. Always hired chemical engineers from a bunch of companies, Ann Arbor, and I had worked at other companies, Purell and so on. And I'd finally worked myself up to the point where I had, after about 8 or 9 years before this rubber program, I had about 60 technical people working for me in an engineering section, and we did a lot of interesting things. I was in charge of an automotive lab they had, with which we tested gasoline, and I went out to different refineries on gas plants. People were making mistakes and analyzing gas, thinking that they had, in a 5,000 barrel refinery, that 500 barrels a day of propane was escaping, but instead of that it was 500 barrels a day of butane. So by a simple low temperature distillation you could increase the gasoline production by about 10%, and I did this in 4 or 5 of their refineries. And but I was always torn between the problem that when I got interested in something technically, it was just about the time that the company would want me to do something non-technical. For example, one morning when I was in the technical service division, I discovered that there was a gas terminal. The engineering was everything, not only refineries, but what was happening in the field. And they had a gas terminal up at Little Falls, which they thought was leaking, and they wanted me to go up right away and repair the leak. And I was pretty much of a tennis player those days, and I'd gotten one of these things where you sprain a tendon in your leg, and I was limping around, and I said, gosh, I can't go up like this. Never mind. The boss, J.B. Rather, who was styled, every top technical man in those days, was the chief chemist of the company, and nothing would happen. I had to take someone along with me, even if he had to hold me up, and go up to Little Falls. So we got on the train, and we started up to Little Falls, which is the New York Central, and I guess it's a little past Albany or Schenectady, and we got up there, and I got into the hotel around 9 o'clock in Little Falls, and I thought, well, I'll get a good night's sleep. And after about an hour or two, I heard ambulances starting to screech through the street, and this went on from about, say, like 11 when you go to bed to about 12 o'clock, constant ambulances. So I finally got up and I thought, my God, what is happening? I went out into the hall, and there was a man walking around in pajamas, and I said, what are you doing in the hall? He said to me, were you in the train wreck? Well, there was a train wreck at Little Falls. It was a snowy, nasty, snowy night, and he told me that he'd been in a train a car, and he was awakened by a sudden crashing, and he put his hand out to get his clothes, and he found the top of the car was missing from that point up, from his upper berth. So he wandered around in the snow until somebody took him to the hotel. And so finally I got up in the morning and went down to the lobby like here, and as I limped into the lobby with my friends, an echelon of insurance agents approached me and asked me if I'd like to settle immediately, thinking that I'd been in the train wreck, of course. So I went out to the Mobile station, and I went to this gasoline station that was up on a hill and on the rocks, and I went, the local undertaker happened to be the one whose house was right next to the gasoline boat terminal, and this man was very anxious to get back into his undertaking business, and he wanted in the worst way to light the furnace in his basement, and the Mobile people told him it was dangerous to light his furnace, and what should he do? So I went downstairs where his furnace was, and I got a 50cc pipette, and I found a crack on the floor, and I stuck the pipette in the crack, and I sucked, and lo and behold, I sucked up about 50cc of a nice brown amber gasoline. That's what Mobile's got. I showed him the sample, and that convinced him that he should start his furnace. By that time I was his friend, and he told me, he asked me how I'd like to see some of the specimens that he had piled up in the garage. And we went in there, you know, and it was really a terrible experience, the first thing like that I've ever seen. Here were people without any clothes on, in pajamas, you know, with arms cut, they'd gotten under the rails, sliced up and stuff like that. They were all in the garage waiting to be taken care of in the undertaking place. So I don't know what he did, but when I left, it was about 3 or 4 months after that it was just about in the 30s, I guess, and planes were coming in, and I always felt much pleasanter about going somewhere in a plane than in a train. When I go anywhere in a sleeper and hear these rails grinding along, it took me really several months to feel comfortable about riding in a train at night. So that constitutes one paragraph of early reflections. I don't know what to take on after that. Is that enough for about 10 years or so, or do you want?
Well, how did you solve the problem of the station?
I told them that they had to take the bottom out of the tank. It was rusted, and replace it, and they couldn't do anything else. And I had a lot of interesting small problems like that. They're elementary, you know, for an engineer, but Mobile didn't have very many engineers. Another one, some people were complaining about smoke in their gasoline, terrible smoke in the gasoline, and I just took a sample of it and put it in a true boiling point still, and I found gasoline had about 10% of fuel oil in it, and luckily boiling above 400, and even though this man had been a long trusted dealer for about 20 or 25 years, I told him that there was something in his gasoline that didn't come to a refinery, it came from his tank, and they found that what he'd been doing was occasionally pumping a little fuel oil into the 5% or so into the gasoline tank, you know, and raising the price from fuel oil to gasoline price. So this was a nice little problem to solve. There were all kinds of those things. And then I formed an engineering group, and we got a lot of interesting things. When we joined the vacuum had a lot of foreign interests, and they had things like, for example, they had umbrella refineries in some of the Iron Curtain countries, and they'd import synthetic crude into these companies. And sometimes there'd be a tax on importing finished products, but there would be no tax if they just take those finished products, mix them up together, and call them crude oil, and put them into a thing they'd call a refinery, and separate the stuff out by distillation. And so I had to design some of those and some asphalt blowing stills. And then about that time, oil was coming in from Iraq, and it was the pipeline went from Iraq out to the Gulf. I guess maybe it still does. And the crude oil was being unloaded in Marseille, France. And the mayor of Marseille didn't like the smell of H2S, and he decreed that there shouldn't be any more gasoline with any H2S imported. So they had to put in some stabilizers to remove propane and H2S. So he designed the stabilizers to remove the propane and the H2S, and so it went. And then one of the last jobs I had with Mobile is they decided Monsanto sold them a lot of additives, and Monsanto were smart people. They never wanted to get into manufacturing like DuPont. They would first corner the market, and then they would come back in and develop whatever facilities were necessary to build what they had a market for. So they wanted to do something with ethylene, and we wanted to build a plant based on ethanol. I forget what it was, 50 million pounds a year of ethylene or something like that. And so I was given the job of looking into the economics and working on the design, being Mobile's man to work with the Monsanto engineering department. And we designed a big thing based on alcohol. It showed about a 4-year payout based on alcohol being worth 20 cents a gallon. That was going to be one of the most important products. And Mobile was not interested, but in about a year the price of alcohol went up to about 80 cents, so if they'd have built it, they could have retired the plant in about 6 months, you know. That's the way economics goes. But a few years later, they built on their own the chocolate volume. But in the meantime, I'd come more and more to the idea, as I said, that I would prefer to be my own man and go in for something where I could do some research instead of every time a problem got to the point where I was interested in it technically, I'd have to start doing something else. So I started taking night courses, and I did some work on fluid mechanics. I got some of the people at Paulsboro there to run some tests, and I knew Don Osmer, and so without too much of a headache, I got my doctor's degree. I discovered pretty soon that having a doctor's degree was the union card to getting into the teaching profession. So after 17 years, I annexed the doctor's degree, and I told, well then, that was about in December, and I decided that instead of having 2 weeks vacation every year, up until when I was with Mobile 15 years, having 3 weeks vacation, that I was going to take a vacation. So I went out to Sun Valley and spent a month or two, and then I was still a bachelor, of course, and then came back, and luckily, right in my own backyard again, the New York University was looking for a head of the chemical engineering department, and the people. Meanwhile, I knew I'd made some good contacts. I knew Alan Colburn pretty well down at Delaware. I'd given some lectures in his courses and organized for him to do some research on our extractive distillation on our butadiene plant. I was always interested in getting the university people in, and I knew Ken Watson, and he was on our technical committee for the design of this butadiene plant in Texas, which incidentally, in 2 years, being a glint in somebody's eye, was a full-blown operation and operated right from the start at full capacity, and really a small miracle to have nothing happen during the war like that. So anyway, they gave me nice letters of recommendation, Ken and Alan, and So they put me in. They gave me a full professorship and tenure, and I'm the head of the department at NYU. And so the transition was very painless. I didn't have to worry about being an assistant professor for 7 years and then wondering whether I'd get promoted or not. And so I started a new career then after 17 years. And among other things, I found time enough to relax to go up to Lake Placid 2 months instead of 2 weeks, and at the same time to meet this charming young lady, and not working so hard again to get married. Don't know what she wanted with me. That's practically a child bride, you know. And so we started raising a family. Dottie's a violinist, so to me it's been a great thing. I enjoy music, but when I was about 30, I discovered that playing a piano with 30-year-old fingers and appreciating the kind of music that you could appreciate at 30 were two different things. So that I had a half a life of learning all the best in music and having it right next door, having a musical accompaniment while I studied, or giving lectures, and so it was great to have intellectual companionship like that of a different type. And so I started doing something different than the oil business. I decided, I always liked mathematics, and I decided if I'm going to go into teaching, I better learn some more mathematics. In the course of my doctor's thesis at Poly, I'd worked on flow-through packed and beds, and I became intrigued about the theories of flow-through packed beds, and quite a wide variety of academic people had been interested in developing theories. There was one man at Columbia, I remember, Bakhmetyev, that had published a book on turbulence. He was another one of the Russian emigres, and had come to this country and started a match factory, and if any Russian would come in, why, he'd give them a job in his match factory. So he was great to talk to me. He had a theory and wrote a little book on turbulence. And I decided then that I was always interested in the quantitative aspects of, and the mathematical aspects of engineering. And so even though I had quite an exposure to catalysis in the Houdry process, and more exposure to catalysis in the butadiene process, what discouraged me about going into that was the empiricism of it. I couldn't see any, didn't like to just take an equation and correlate it by a power law model like Saul Weller does the rates. And so that I didn't want to do theoretical work on catalysis at the moment, and I got into hydrodynamics instead. Hydrodynamics of slow, viscous flow, not turbulent flow, was something that was very elegant. You could develop these equations in the most elegant form. And luckily, I got some students that I was able to convince that this was a good field of research. And one of my first students, the first doctoral student, is Norm Epstein, who is now the editor of the Canadian Chemical Engineering Journal and chairman of the Chem Engineering Department at Vancouver. And he's carried this fluid mechanics work forward into spouted beds, which turned out to be very important. Around in this area, spouted beds are used for drying grain, which is an important operation. He's told me they had a lot of other such spouted bed applications. And then another one of my students was Bob Pfeffer, all hydrodynamics, you know, and he went to City College, became the chairman of the department, got a lot of money out of NSF for studying the flow of blood, which is also a low Reynolds number phenomenon, and really continued on the flow of blood because he had a heart condition that required triple bypass. So I guess he's more had a real interest in hydrodynamics of that sort. And he's just now become provost at City College, and another prize student and I got together and wrote a book on hydrodynamics of about 500 pages, which after 20 years is still selling a few hundred copies a year, and he's now the Willard Dow Professor of Chemical Engineering at MIT. So the hydrodynamics was a nice, should I say, a nice pause in a career devoted maybe to catalysis. But I finally went to Japan about 25 years ago, and I met Jiro Horiyuchi, who was the dean of the catalytic chemists in Japan. He was up in Sapporo. I spent a couple of months in Japan in the course of a sabbatical at Hawaii. My wife and family stayed in Hawaii. Unfortunately, one of our children got sick, or they would have spent some time in Japan. But anyway, I went up to Sapporo, and I really, Horiyuchi and I became great friends. He'd developed a thing that I'm still working on and talked about today, namely that adding tracers, using tracers in to study chemical catalytic reactions was a way of attacking catalysis from a quantitative viewpoint. This is what appealed to me. Here was a way not of just developing Langmuir-Hinscher equations or polar equations, but of having nothing but material balances and being able to, just with that modicum of information, to be able to tell in principle what the slow steps were and what the concentrations of surface species were for catalytic chemical reactions. Well, Horiyuchi liked me as much as I liked him, and he had students all over Japan, and he arranged me to go to the 12 previous imperial universities, all the way from Hokkaido down to the southern tip in Kagoshima. These former imperial universities had all the money. There were about 50 universities in Japan, but the ones that had been the former imperial universities had the funding. And his students and his students were working at these places. So I absorbed a lot more momentum in going into using traces to study catalysis. And when I came back to the United States, I succeeded in encouraging a number of the students to come and work with me in this country, and they did for a whole period of 20 years. I had one up until about a year or two ago. And I first worked on the same general lines that Horiyuchi did, with sulfur dioxide oxidation, and then started into, when I started working on the mathematics of it, I discovered that these things could be much more effective if you used transient tracing instead of steady-state tracing. With, I don't know if you know, but with steady-state tracing, all you can get is the velocities, because if there's anything on the surface at steady state, it doesn't change. You have to run it unsteady. If you want to get the unsteady state concentration, you have to start out with a system where there's no marked species on the surface. Then if you put in the marked species, of course, there's going to be a certain delay while the marked species build up on the surface of the catalyst. So that intrigued me, and the mathematics intrigued me a great deal. And like often happens, luck plays such a part that as this hydrodynamics business, I was lucky in getting a handful of students. I was lucky in going to Japan and meeting Horiyuchi. And again, I was lucky. I went out to Chicago to one of these meetings that INEC used to hold, a symposium around Christmas time. And here was a mathematician, Peter Sellers, from Rockefeller University. And he had been doing some work with Britton Chance on biochemical reactions, but I was interested in applying mathematics to chemical reactions. And his forte is working at Rockefeller University is to develop algorithms for figuring out the DNA sequences in proteins. You may have a DNA sequence in a shark's fin, let's say, and like to see whether this sequence is duplicated in another perhaps part of a human being. And so he had developed an algorithm for doing this. And the same mathematics could be applied to chemical systems. And so we attacked this problem of if you have if you assume a set of elementary steps, can you mathematically deduce what all the possible mechanisms could be from those steps? And if you leave out some of those steps, you're making a mistake. And a classic case, for example, is when I met Horiyuchi. He had developed and spent many years on working on the mechanism of ammonia synthesis. And he had a 5-step mechanism, nothing left over. The ammonia would be produced from nitrogen and hydrogen by hydrogen first dissociating into atomic chemisorbed hydrogen, and nitrogen being adsorbed into atomic chemisorbed nitrogen, and then the nitrogen and hydrogen combining from an NH adsorbed species, and so on. And in 5 steps, you'd make ammonia, and there'd be nothing left over. Each species would fit in quite nicely. 5 steps, and a certain number of intermediates, I think 5 intermediates too. But Chomkin, who was in Japan and who thought a great deal of, in Russia, and who studied ammonia also, and who was the father of the Chomkin-Kirchhoff equation, which is still being widely used for designing ammonia plants, and which Boudard has written up in his book as a good mechanism, had a 4-step mechanism. His mechanism was to take nitrogen, instead of dissociatively absorbing it, N2 would adsorb as such, hydrogen would adsorb as such, they would form N2H2 adsorbed, and so forth. And in 4 steps you would make ammonia. So this was just the beginning of what I could seem to me was a very beautiful example of a practical use of what I was doing with cellars, because here both of these men are experts. No one would argue that each of these sets of adsorbed species wasn't logical. The only thing that was wrong was that each one was willing to shut out the other and forget. Temkin would shut out the 5 steps of Horiyuchi and have a mechanism. Horiyuchi would shut out the 5 steps of Temkin and have a mechanism. What could happen if you took the whole 9 steps and asked, how would you make ammonia? Well, I wrote that up in my book. You get 6 different possibilities for making ammonia. I haven't got the time or the money from the NSF, unfortunately, to study it, but you should study all of these species. And thereupon, I had another piece of luck, as I started in doing this modeling with cellars, and based on what I'd learned from Horiyuchi and switched from his steady state to transient tracing, I happened to, I was working with Jochen Bloch in Berlin on some work connected with catalysis and his temp field program desorption. And we were in West Berlin, and we thought, well, it's a nice place to be, but my wife said, isn't there someplace else that we can go? And I said, well, this fellow from Paris has been communicating with me about things he's been doing, and so we decided maybe we should look up the man from Paris. So we went to Paris, and sure enough, Henrique Voltaire was very much interested in what we were doing. He had a whole new branch of mathematical work. He was in the École d'Électricité, the department of, was it Système, and he was an electrical engineer. He wasn't an electrical engineer in the old sense of electric motors. He was interested in modeling of of electrical systems, and these systems are in a bunch of sets of simultaneous linear differential equations when you get into the mathematics of it. And he'd even done a little work with someone else on chemical reactions, homogeneous reactions. And so the equations that he was solving and was greatly familiar with in his electrical control theory were just the equations that I was fooling around with, whereupon he introduced me to two very important concepts, the idea of identifiability and distinguishability. And these are two that many people still haven't caught up with. The question most chemical engineers, as I was doing up until the time I met Art, would take a chemical reaction, they would proceed to model it and see if they could get parameters. Then they would take another one and see if they could get parameters, and then you'd pick the one that maybe gave you the best parameters and say that's it, the minimum sum of squares. But he raised a nasty question, and that was, could it be possible that that if you took a certain model, you could get parameters, and that if you took another model, that would also give you parameters, so that getting a set of parameters wouldn't necessarily, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Could you get parameters or could you not? If you could not, the thing was not identifiable. If you used a computer program, the computer will always, between nonlinear least squares and this Marquardt method, will always give you convergence at some kind of an answer. But when you've got the best answer, you can't be sure that the thing is identifiable. And if it isn't, if the model that you've written down is a differential equation without having any data, if the model itself will not yield the parameters, then no matter what kind of a computer program you put it in, it's not going to yield them. There's no use in modeling something if in principle you can't get the parameters that you're looking for. And then, as I started in, the other nasty thing is, suppose it can be modeled, but now you pick another model, and you find that again you can get the parameters. So now the question is, can you distinguish these two models? Then, of course, will be indistinguishable. So what you want to ask is like in the case of the ammonia, and I wrote this up in my book, you take these things 2 by 2, and I put a little matrix in, and you ask yourself, is each one of these models identifiable? And comparing each one with another, can you distinguish it from the other? And if you can't, well, you've got to do some other kind of experimentation. And so this puts a much sharper point on the pencil of modeling. And we discovered with a reaction I published in the AICHE journal that one of these models was identifiable, all right, and that we could generate 9 other models that would also be identifiable, that couldn't be distinguished from the one that you were looking at. And not only that, but you could, in a very elegant way, if you had the solution for what the parameters would be for one of these models, what the parameters would be, you wouldn't have to go through any computer modeling with the others. You could generate all of the 9 solutions. So that was quite an eye-opener for me, and so we've been following that thing along. And between these mathematical additions and the experimental work, it's been quite an exciting thing. I've just been lucky, and I told Dottie, in discovering mathematicians that are interested in what I'm interested in. Many mathematicians are interested in proving existence theorems and all that kind of stuff. So finally, Bill Gill, who's up at Potsdam, called me up, and he said, Howard Brenner is wanting to have an 80th year birthday party for you with a symposium down in New York, and I'd like to get together a series of papers celebrating your 80th birthday. So that was my next project, to get these papers. We've got about, I got about 20 from the field of fluid mechanics, and about 25 or so from all of these things between Eric Walter and my friend Peter Sellers, and several of the Japanese people that have worked on catalysis. It'll be a nice, it'll be published in Chemical Engineering Communications. And then they wanted to have a birthday party and a symposium, and about a month before they would have the birthday party, I went with my wife and daughter down to TCAL, and maybe I told you that, and to investigate archaeology, you know. And this is in the country of the Maya. The Maya pyramids are very interesting, and in the course of walking up on top of one of these Maya pyramids, I stumbled and fell about 40 feet and broke 2 vertebrae in my neck. My daughter said that this gave rise to a new theory of how the ancient Maya civilization fell down and ran into decadence around 1300. Namely, that not that that they ran out of corn or that the government was too oppressive, but that the priests spent too much time fooling around in the tops of these temples, and every once in a while one of them would fall down and break his neck, and in the meantime the slaves at the bottom weren't so dumb as to go climbing up these things. They let the jungle take over. Anyway, in my case, it took about an operation on the part of a neurosurgeon to wire together these 2 vertebrae, and then to take a slice of bone off my hip and try to fuse it. And so that's about 3.5 months ago now, and I could have been a paraplegic, but luckily the doctors who were down in Guatemala were a very fine team of men. They knew just what the right thing was to do, and they pulled me out of the thing. I have a little trouble raising my... I can still write. After a week I could sign checks very well, but to raise my right arm and have a drink is still a problem. I have to use the left hand to...
That doesn't say anything about the medical profession, does it?
No. So that brings us up to the present, unless you...
Well, when are you going to have your... You going to have your... this for the 81st birthday now?
Well, one of the Japanese sent me... A lot of the Japanese that I worked with sent me nice pictures, and here's one that just came and just brought me a little frame. But one of them sent a greeting with a kind of a double mountain on it, and he said 80th isn't the thing. They've got all kinds of magic numbers in Japan that this under this is 88, and 88 is really the number, you see. So I still have 8 years to go before I kick the bucket, I guess, on that basis. So we'll see.
I don't think of any.
Huh?
I don't think of anything.
You don't think of anything? Okay.